Good evening, everybody. My name is Jeff Batchen. I am Professor of History of Art here at the University of Oxford, and it's my great honour and pleasure to introduce the presenter of this year's D.F. McKenzie Lecture, Richard Ovenden. Richard, as many of you will know, has been Bodley's librarian since 2014, but he has in fact graced the Bodleian libraries in one capacity or another since 2003. Just this year, he has been further elevated, having become the new head of GLAM, Gardens, Libraries and Museums for the university. As Bodley's librarian, Richard is ultimately responsible for the care of more than 12 million printed items. This alone makes him a fitting speaker in this series of annual lectures dedicated to the history of the book and related issues. However, Richard makes, or at least writes, his own books as well. Particularly pertinent is his 2020 award-winning volume titled Burning the Books, A History of Knowledge Under Attack. Only this past week, The Guardian reported on a library in Mississippi that is under threat from the local mayor who wanted to remove certain books from its shelves. It seems that a defence of both books and libraries remains necessary and even essential in a world where the printed word still all too frequently comes under attack. However, this evening's lecture happens to be about the history of the relationship of the book and the photograph. It therefore immediately takes Richard back to his beginnings, or at least back to his first book, published in 1997, about the well-travelled Scottish photographer John Thomson. This book is how I first came to know the name of Richard Ovenden. For me, he is the celebrated photo historian first and a librarian second. And indeed, as a photo historian myself, I've been fortunate to arrive at Oxford during a golden age for those interested in exploring the history of that medium in this city. Under Richard's leadership, in 2014, the Bodleian acquired the extensive archive of England's inventor of photography, William Henry Fox Talbot, and secured the permanent loan of another 200 photographs by Talbot only last year. The Bodleian already hosts the online catalogue raisonné of the 15,000 photographs made by this pioneering English figure. Exhibitions and books organised by the Bodleian and dedicated to this extraordinary conjunction of Talbot material are due in 2023. However, Richard's transformation of the Bodleian into a premier site for the study of photography doesn't end there. In 2018, the library was gifted the complete archive of the social documentary photographer Daniel Meadows, and in 2019 was also given the Helen Muspratt photographic archive, including over 2,000 of her original prints and numerous surviving negatives. Books have been issued by the Bodleian Library Publishing about both these archives' bodies of work, and another about an album of photographs by Julia Margaret Cameron is imminent. For those who will be inspired by this evening's lecture to pursue the history of the photo book, in 2019, the Bodleian managed to secure a gift of 2,000 of the world's rarest 20th century examples from Sir Charles Chadwick Healy. Negotiations are currently underway for another extraordinary gift of 19th century photo albums, which will beautifully complement the Chadwick Healy collection. As I've said, these acquisitions make the Bodleian a crucial depository of important photographs and photographic books. But they also serve to remind us that this has always been the case. For the past 170 years, the Bodleian has been acquiring photographs without consciously setting out to do so. These photographs can be found inside books of every genre, in archives and in miscellaneous collections scattered throughout the Bodleian libraries, if you care to look for them. That looking will soon be made easier with the help of the Bodleian's first ever curator of photographs, who, thanks to Richard's initiative and the sponsorship of Byrne and Ronnie Schwartz, is due to start work just next month in March. Later this year, we will also enjoy a visit from the first of the annual Sloan Fellows in Photography, who will be coming to conduct research on an aspect of the Bodleian's photographic collections. This then is the background to Richard's choice of topic for this lecture this evening, a rumination on what photography has done to the book, but also on what the publishing industry has done to the photograph. I'm sure we're all going to learn something from his insights. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Richard Ovenden to the podium to deliver this year's F.D. McKenzie Lecture.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeff. That's a very generous introduction, and thank you all very much, both those of you here in the English faculty and those of you joining online to come and listen to those ruminations. And it's a great honour to be giving this lecture in particular, and I'd like to thank Peter MacDonald and Michael Suarez for the invitation. And it's very strange to be giving this lecture when I've sat with you for 20 years now, listening to them and being inspired by them. And I hope to do the name of Don McKenzie justice today. On the 27th of July, 1844, the Bodleian Library received a delivery of books and periodicals from Stationers' Hall, these being new publications sent under the legal deposit privilege. The delivery contained a landmark publication, the first fascicule of William Henry Fox Talbot's The Pencil of Nature, the first book illustrated with photographs to be commercially published, and the first photographs to enter the collections of the Bodleian. This was just 5 years after the announcements of photography by Talbot in London and by Louis Daguerre in Paris. The book is an obvious one to begin this lecture with, but perhaps all the more so as the first image in the first book commercially to be made available, to be illustrated with photographs, was of an Oxford college, Queen's College to be precise. Its negative taken on the 4th of September 1843. So this is a print from one of the surviving copies of The Pencil of Nature, and this is a rather stronger print from, not from one of the books, but printed separately by Talbot. Talbot was himself deeply interested in the interplay between photography and the book. The new technology would enable every man his own printer and publisher, he declared in a letter to Sir John Herschel in March 1839, although his conception at this point was merely to enable poor authors to make facsimiles of their own handwriting. But it was also essential that he distinguish his technology from more familiar methods of reproduction. He had quickly to insert a notice to the reader in the fascicules of his book. The plates of the present work are impressed by the agency of light alone, without any aid whatever from the artist's pencil. They are sun pictures themselves, and not, as some persons have imagined, engravings in imitation. As early as December 1839, Talbot had realised the broader impact that photography could make on the book world. In a letter to Herschel, another letter to Herschel, he wrote that, although the perfection of the French method of photography cannot be surpassed in some respects, yet in others the English is decidedly superior. For instance, in the capability of the multiplication of copies and therefore of publishing a work with photographic plates. The Pencil of Nature was Talbot's visual and verbal manifesto for photography, reproduced by a combination of letterpress, lithography and real photographs, which were mass-produced at Talbot's Reading establishment. And here they are basically in the back garden of a residential property in Reading, printing out with sunlight the plates, the images that would be inserted into the print run. These prints and the nomenclature of early photography could hardly be more bookish. Were mounted on special paper by hand and inserted into the letterpress stock before being bound in cloth and glued together with gutta percha. The whole was issued commercially in 6 parts by Longman, Brown, Green and Longmans, with lithographically decorated wrappers designed by Owen Jones. And in our Talbot archive, we actually have Jones's watercolour sketch for the cover. It was issued between 1844 and 1846, with a total of 24 plates being reproduced across these issues. The parts varied in size of print run and indeed in price, beginning with 12 shillings for the first part and 7 and 6 for the final. Larry Schaff's third census of the pencil located 40 complete copies, either sets of parts or bound up sets, and a further 40 incomplete sets, although there were a number of presentation copies made by Talbot as he tried to make waves with his new venture. It did make a few waves, but not enough to transform his fortunes. Talbot was bullish about the transformative potential in advance of publication. He wrote to his beloved half-sister Horatia in February 1839 that I have announced in Longman and Company's catalogue or monthly list the forthcoming appearance of a work to be entitled The Pencil of Nature. We mean to guarantee to the public that the plates will be executed by persons who know nothing whatever of drawing, and that they may have all confidence in what they may find there, since no artist is to be allowed to have any hand in it. The Athenaeum reviewed the second part in January 1845, commenting that photography has already enabled us to hand down to future ages a picture of the sunshine of yesterday, or a memorial of the haze of today. The experiment of photographically illustrated books is now before the world, and all who see Mr. Talbot's production will be convinced that the promise of the art is great and its utility and excellence in many respects of a high order. Despite the positive reviews and the posthumous praise, the book was actually a commercial flop. Talbot's grand plan to issue 50 photographs had to be abandoned, and his first fascicle being released in April 1846, with his final fascicle being released in April 1846. As far as the Bodleian is concerned then, the origins of photography begin with a book, and a book with a rich and complex history associated with it, and from the means of production to the publishing history, and to say nothing of its impact across time through successive generations of readers and viewers. It is this interaction, the interaction between the history of photography and the history of the book, to which I want to devote this lecture. I did not know John McKenzie well, but he was kind to me as a young rare books curator at the National Library of Scotland when he came on research visits. However, we never got to discuss photographic books, which I was beginning to trawl through the NLS's collections looking for. But in his wonderful essay, What's Past is Prologue, delivered as a lecture marking the centenary of the Bibliographical Society, he focused on Talbot's great innovation, the concept of the negative, from which could be produced a multitude of positive copies. Don felt this to be illustrative of bibliography's key problem, the relationship between the negative as the master text and the print as a derivative which is almost infinitely variable by different agents. Implicit in the problem is not only the accuracy and value of the product as historical evidence, but the question of authority in respect of any changes made. The opportunity that exists before us, I think, is enticing. I would like to propose a unification of these two fields that I feel so personally committed to, the history of the book and the history of photography. These are major challenges, of course. For the photo historian, they relate back to the bibliographer or literary critic's overwhelming desire to get back to the original intention of the author, or perhaps creator would be better here. Is this the crucial thing for us to understand? What we must focus on, I think, as we think about the photograph and the book, is the extent to which the photographer was part of a team that worked together to see the end result match their intentions. We have the photographer, but we also have their agents and their publisher. This is quite familiar territory for the book historian. But for photography, the printers of the photographs are also of extreme importance, and it is they who have the greatest impact of that translation from the visual idea held by the photographer to the image seen by the reader. The people responsible for printing the original photographs, i.e. in the darkroom, are just one link in this chain. Those responsible for re-photographing these original prints and generating a copy that can be used to create a printing plate make as critical a contribution as the printing and the book production itself. As I hope to show later in this lecture, there are a host of other players in the ecosystem of the photographic book, all focused on this crucial vehicle for disseminating the photographic image to an increasingly broad public, one which even in a world dominated by the digital image, as we are today, still commands a central position in the world of photography. There was no such thing as a photo book when I began to be interested in the field in the 1980s. Indeed, the word has only entered into the vernacular in the 21st century. There were only a handful of reference works which are of any use back then, but it's worth spending a little time describing some of them and critiquing them, but also praising them for their contribution to our understanding of the interplay between the photograph and the book. And I snapped Martin Parr's reference shelf behind me, which is what you can see. I pause to doff my cap, so to speak, to Rolf Schultz, who did critical early work in this field. But I didn't know about that at the time when I was a curator in the rare books department at the NLS. So what I'm going to focus on now is the books that I did use on my shelf, as it were, up on George IV Bridge. The first was Julia Van Haften's Survey of Holdings in the New York Public Library, published in its bulletin in 1977. Comprised a long article entitled Original Sun Pictures, a checklist of the New York Public Library's holdings of early works, illustrated with photographs, 1844 to 1900. Her survey, beginning with the pencil of nature, of course, described in short title form some 465 books and 96 albums in the NYPL's collections. She refers to her work as being a response to the growth industry of the history of photography, and what she was doing was creating a valuable research infrastructure to help move the field forward and to support and encourage further research. In referring to the existing guides to holdings of original photographs, she highlighted that there was still another format in which early photographs made their appearance, which is not extensively covered in the existing library's guide, but which is amply represented in all divisions of the research libraries, the original photographic print as book illustration. The descriptions, though short, include good, accurate details of the modes of illustration used. A final entry is for the 1900 edition of Thomas Annan's The Old Closes and Streets of Glasgow, which has its harrowing scenes of urban deprivation illustrated by beautiful photogravures. There must have been something in the Manhattan air at the time, as 3 years before her article appeared, that wonderful bibliographic institution located 18 blocks north, the Grolier Club, mounted an exhibition called The Truthful Lens, a survey of the photographically illustrated book 1844 to 1914. It also published a book of the same name in 1980, edited by the curators of that show, Weston Neff at that time, an associate curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the veteran rare book dealer Lucien Goldschmidt. The foreword to the book by the club's president at the time announced that until now there's been no reference work describing books illustrated with original photographs. Such a book could easily contain 2,500 titles. In fact, it described just 192 books, beginning not, in fact, with the pencil of nature, as the title page suggested, but with Anna Atkin's British Algae, an album of cyanotypes privately produced in 1843. And I show here one part of Anna Atkin's pioneering work, which is in the collection of the Museum of the History of Science here in Oxford. And it's just the most stunning, incredible thing. The entries in the Truthful Lens are short, with little in the way of bibliographic description, and like Van Haften, no copy-specific details are mentioned at all. But the entries did have lengthy narrative captions, which give a lot of information. The third go-to bibliographical publication in those days was the work of the veteran photographer, collector, and photo historian Helmut Gernsheim. His Incunabula of British Photographic Literature, a bibliography of British Photographic Literature 1839-75, and British books illustrated with original photographs, used a term highly resonant for bibliophiles, Incunabula, drawing a neat analogy with the earliest and rarest Western books with movable type. I never met Gernsheim, but he comes across as not being a terribly shy man. These bibliographies are the first catalogue raisonné to be published in any country, he says. The listings he reproduced were created in the first place to help him build his own collection, which is now in the Ransom Center at the University of Texas, Austin. He bought the books cheaply, he recounts, or rather boasts, as there was no demand for this type of publication, prices were generally low. Gernsheim's Incunabula in the end described 1,888 books, but roughly half of these were manuals of photography, and only 638 were straightforwardly books illustrated with pasted in original prints. If anything, the entries are even briefer than Van Haften's and those in Goldschmidt and Neff, but it was nonetheless a huge boon for a rare books curator in a legal deposit library to help go through the collections, as I did over many lunch hours, just pulling books off the shelf to see if I could find any not in Gernsheim. I think I added about 300. My colleague Colin Harris here in the Bodleian has recently identified another 298 in the Bodleian's collections, and he's still looking. Two publications in the 21st century have been particularly influential in focusing interest in the photographic book. Andrew Roth's A Book of 101 Books, Seminal Photographic Books of the 20th Century, and Martin Parr and Jerry Badger's phenomenal 3-volume The Photo Book, A History, have sold incredibly well and are frequently cited in other publications, especially in the book trade and occasionally in library catalogue records. What do these books contribute to our understanding of the genre? The first thing to say about them is that, to the book historian and bibliographer, they are somewhat frustrating. Gernsheim was at least attempting to be comprehensive, although he didn't look he didn't look further than his own collection and the British libraries. The more recent efforts of Roth and Parr and Badger, in contrast, are both highly subjective lists, selected primarily for the influential quality of the photography displayed on the pages and the books selected. They have, as a result, become guides for other collectors. One immediate result is that the prices for such books have risen enormously. The entries are very much about the importance of the photographs and the photographer rather than the form of the book which is being described. In fact, there isn't much in the way of bibliographical description at all. The titles are short and often abbreviated, the size, pagination and makeup of the books are poorly described, and the bindings are sometimes mentioned, but not that often. We're told who the publishers were, but not the printers, and only very occasionally who the designers and others involved in the production. Given the primacy of the photographic image, the way in which the visual information is produced for the pages of the book gets scant treatment. Crucially, we aren't told what method of photomechanical reproduction was used to create the plates. So Roth, Parr and Badger, and the host of other books published in recent years about photographic books, especially those by Horacio Fernandez and by Manfred Heiting, which follow the same pattern, leave the bibliographer and the book historian wanting more. But what they have done is to highlight the great importance and richness of the genre. They've shone light into previously obscure areas of photographic history, and more recent publications, being so well illustrated and designed, could become models for how bibliographic works on any subject could look and feel. If the new wave of books about photo books leave out most of the interesting bits for bibliographers and book historians, it's only fair to examine the problem for the other direction, and to look at some recent important histories of the book and see how they treat the photograph. Perhaps the obvious place to start is the Cambridge History of the Book in Britain. Volume 6, 1830 to 1940, published in 2009, for example, contains only 6 references to photography in its index, for a work of over 800 pages. Michael Twyman's excellent chapter on the illustration revolution treats photography over 4 pages, but even then gets sidetracked by some of the more obscure photographic processes. Volume 7 of the Cambridge History of the Book in Britain, covering the 20th century, has a whopping 10 entries for photography in its index, and does treat the phenomenon of the illustrated magazines at some length. But otherwise we get the familiar story, where photography is covered on perhaps 15 pages in a book that's more than 750 pages long. Philip Gaskell's new introduction to bibliography, dedicated to Don McKenzie, and still a go-to text for the book historian, gives us 3 pages on photography out of a 7-page section on processes of reproduction, based very much on Ada's 1945 history of photography and on Gernsheim's history of 1970. Things have improved a bit since then, thanks especially to David McKitterick, who in Old Books, New Technologies, 2013, devotes an entire chapter of 24 pages to the arrival of photography. But as his focus is on facsimiles of old books, the discussion is of necessity specific rather than broad. This is a rather brief skate through the book historical literature, but I think it gives a fair indication of how little attention photography has received in the major publications on the history of the book since Talbot's technology first appeared in the pages, or perhaps on the pages, of books in the middle of the 19th century. Photography did not emerge like lightning from an empty sky. There was a long period of scientific and technological experimentation and discovery that enabled Niepce, Daguerre and Talbot to take their transformative steps in photography. And the photo book emerged into an already sophisticated and complex world of print, often termed by book historians print culture. The way that photography adapted its technological advantage to this print culture can be seen in the life and work of the Scottish photographer John Thomson, and here he is on the left of your screen. Thompson was born in Edinburgh in 1837 and is perhaps best known today for two reasons. Firstly, his work in Asia, where he was the first photographer to visit Angkor Wat in Cambodia, but also among the first photographers to document China in all its aspects. The second reason for his contemporary fame is his photographs taken on the streets of London in the 1870s, which are now regarded as among the first street photography and are frequently reproduced in print and TV media. But I came to Thompson through the world of print while I was a curator of rare books in Edinburgh. Thompson published a series of interesting and important photographically illustrated books, beginning with The Antiquities of Cambodia in 1868, which was a book with real photographs, albumin prints, pasted onto blank sheets to hold them, to hold the prints. His most famous book was the 4-volume deluxe publication, Illustrations of China and Its People, published in London, 1873-4. And it was illustrated very differently, with the images reproduced through photomechanical collotype process, a form of photolithography, and therefore printed in ink. And you can see the sheen of the coated paper, the coated stock, which the collotypes were printed on here. And that's one of the most famous images from Illustrations of China. Thompson produced a host of other books, published in Hong Kong and London, and through which he experimented with various kinds of evolving technological solutions to having his photographs reproduced in the pages of those books, alongside text reproduced in letterpress. In this sense, Thompson is the perfect way to understand the interplay between the photograph and the book, and the evolution of technologies of image reproduction, beginning with original silver prints pasted into pages of the book, like this one, with the inherent problems of fading, through to the use of pigments such as carbon to replace silver, majestically in his book Fu Chao and the River Min, and on to the then new technology of collotype, allowing the image to be printed in ink for his Illustrations of China. The print culture he grew up in and matured with as a photographer gave him numerous ways of both earning a living, establishing his name and reputation, and most importantly, disseminating his photographs. He experimented with forms of publication, mainly through the traditional route, but also through private production in the case of Fu Chao, and serial publication. His now highly regarded Street Life in London was illustrated with a complicated, expensive, and now almost forgotten process of Woodbury type, produced in 12 parts between 1876 and 1877, with unsold parts being bound up by the publisher and issued as a separate publication called Street Incidents. And that's how it appears in the Bodleians, or one of the Bodleians sets of Street Life in its bound form. And we also have some of the parts, and then this sort of remaindered edition of unsold parts called Street Incidents. One of his books used high-quality photogravure at one end of the spectrum, and the new mass-market technology of half-tone letterpress at the other end. Thompson's fame and success, his ability to move from being the son of a tobacconist in Edinburgh, educating himself at evening classes at a mechanics institute, to later becoming a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and eventually holding the Royal Warrant as a photographer, was due to his successful inhabitation of the world of print, and not just as a producer. He was reading the English translation of Henri Muot's account of the ruins in Cambodia that prompted his photographic journey there. His publication, so that's in Muot's, the English edition of Muot's book on Angkor Wat, and this is one of Thompson's photographs of the same building. His publication of his book, Antiquities of Cambodia, was greeted by great fanfare and excitement in the scholarly and literary circles of Victorian Britain, and brought reviews in newspapers and journals. It won him a fellowship of the Royal Geographical Society, with his work becoming cited by other more established scholars, such as the anthropologist J.D. Ferguson. One of the routes into this world of print was through the medium of wood engraving, in the newly emerging world of illustrated magazines. I will not describe this world in great detail, especially with Professor Batchen in the audience, who has powerfully opened up their role in disseminating photography. But from as early as the 1840s, the Illustrated London News and other magazines translated photographs, including otherwise unique daguerreotypes, in this case by Antoine Claudet, a panorama of London, with incredible skill and fidelity to the printed pages through the medium of the wood engraved block. It's a reminder that any comprehensive history of the relationship of photography in the book will need to carefully define its terms. The first book commercially published to be illustrated with photographs was Talbot's Pencil of Nature, as we heard earlier, but the first book to be illustrated with photographic images was L'Héribourg's Excursion daguerréenne, the first fascicule of which, comprising steel engravings after daguerreotypes, along with accompanying text, was issued in Paris in 1840. Sadly, the Bodleian doesn't have a copy of this. All copies gratefully received. Back to Thompson. Whilst in Southeast Asia, he forged an opportunity to have his photographs circulated back in Britain through this powerful new popular form of the wood engraving in the pages of the Illustrated London News. These images, like this one, the King of Siam's state barge, were a means of gaining income while he was still in the expensive phase of travelling to build his stock of images. But it also helped to build his reputation. So here's his photograph in the Illustrated London News, and here's a print from one of the negatives, which is in the Wellcome Library in London. He later transferred his allegiance to the Illustrated London News's rival, the Graphic, which published his photographs taken in China as wood engravings on 16 occasions in 1872 and 1873. These again brought in income, helped to build an audience, a readership, as many of the wood engraved images would later appear as actual photographic images in the pages of his later books. To transition from the short-run pasted-in photographic plate or the short-run high-quality photographically produced photographic book to a more mass-market way of engaging with the world of print came in 1875 with the publication of The Straits of Malacca, Indochina and China, from the London publishers Sampson Low, Marston Low and Searle, a house that had established a reputation for high-quality illustrated books, especially photographic books. They were the publishers of Illustrations of China and of Street Life. But their mass-market venture for Thompson was a book which reproduced his images as high-quality wood engravings. I hope you get kind of some sense of the extraordinary quality of those images. You can see here, this is the wood engraved image in the Straits of Malacca, and this is the collotype plate from Illustrations of China and its People. The Straits of Malacca had a large print run, though we don't know the exact details as the publishing house records don't survive, and was also published in French, Italian and US editions. Thompson would continue to seek other publishing options which aimed at mass markets, which extended his use of technology, ending up with Through China with a Camera, with his images reproduced by the half-tone letterpress process quite handsomely, with this copy neatly showing his impact as a photographer, reaching ever wider and younger audiences through the medium of print, in this case as a school prize book. One other thing is worth mentioning. Thompson was already a well-known and much discussed figure in the photo history world by the time I did my exhibition and his study. And his publications are rightly celebrated by Weston Neff, Clark Worswick, Helmut Gernsheim, etc. in their books on photography in China. But all along, the printing house records for the Chiswick Press, who were the printers for Illustrations of China, arguably his most influential book, and for Fu Chao and the River Min, easily his rarest, and that's what you can see in the image, sat there unconsulted in the British Library. And I'm just showing you some of the images from the Foucault book, which are just the most incredible, powerful carbon prints. So we have the details for the print run of both illustrations and for Foucault, and particularly important for Foucault because it had been assumed it existed only in 3 copies, which is all that scholars could find when I did my book and exhibition. The Chiswick Press Archives tells us that 45 copies had been produced. I now know of 6. The hunt for more is on, especially as the price keeps edging up closer and closer to $1 million. Walker Evans's American Photographs, published by the Museum of Modern Art in 1938, is widely regarded by the new clutch of books on photo books as being one of the great examples of the genre in the 20th century. Both Roth and Power and Badger devote a lot of space to it, and rightly so. They highlight the fact that the book was published alongside the first exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art to be devoted to a single photographer, and they sensibly draw attention to the sequencing of the images and the text written by Lincoln Kirstein. In Power and Badger, we get images of several page layouts, so that we can see the key fact that the images are reproduced on the rectos only, and that the versos are left blank. Roth's entry focuses on the comments on its publication by Eleanor Roosevelt, who was deeply moved by it, and by Ansel Adams, who was offended by its left-leaning implications. But neither actually tell us very much about the book. We're told that the book is beautifully sequenced, but not that it was printed in 2 sequences, punctuated by a series of captions, that it was entirely printed on coated paper, the type a mixture of linotype and handset Caslon. The image is reproduced through the half-tone letterpress medium, but of an extraordinarily high quality by the Beck Engraving Company in New York. The sequencing is not only the key design decision. The mise-en-page was carefully arranged, as I was saying, so that the page numbers are carefully placed at the far edge of the otherwise blank and white versos and do not divert the eye from the images themselves. In all the many pages in the photographic literature, little is made of the fact that the book was actually printed at the Spiral Press, a fine printing establishment headed by the great American printer and publisher Joseph Blumenthal. In 1939, American Photographs was one of the American Institute for Graphic Arts' top 50 books of the year. What was Blumenthal's role in the design and execution of this great book? How did he work with Evans? Blumenthal and the Spiral Press got the contract to publish the MoMA catalogues in the early 1930s. And they not only did American Photographs with the plates made by the Beck Engraving Company, but they also produced the first edition of Beaumont Newhall's classic Photography 1839 to 1937, with the 2 books issued in consecutive years. Reading Blumenthal's autobiography, there is another photography connection in that he had a close relationship with Ernest Weher, an immigrant European bookseller. Weher had published Berenice Abbott's monograph on Eugene Aget, a hugely influential publication which opened up Aget's work to a modernist American audience. Blumenthal and the Spiral Press would go on working for Evans, reproducing his album for Wheaton College, for example, in 1941. Walker Evans lived and worked and earned an income through the world of 20th century American print culture. As David Campani has shown, his work appeared in numerous magazine pieces and commissions for journals such as Hound and Horn, which you can see on the screen in front of you. So the appearance of his images on the printed page was of great importance to Evans, and it helped form his audience, his reputation, and of course, his income. But the nature and the reproductions of his images vary a lot in these magazines. Hound and Horn reproduced Evans' work in the April-June 1933 issue in luscious rotogravure on a coated stock, printed on rectos only, and inserted expensively amid the letterpress. The 1948 Fortune treatment is very different. The images are integrated with the text and reproduced by half-tone blocks. But Fortune had a much higher circulation than Hound and Horn and presumably paid better. Which brings us to audience. Who were seeing Evans's work in this printed form and how did they appreciate it? We know that Evans made his first mark with the frontispiece to an edition of Hart Crane's The Bridge, published in New York by Hollis Liveright in 1930. The book was certainly seen as avant-garde. The Bodleian's copy was sold new by Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare and Company in Paris to an Irish poet, Sean Rafferty. A copy sold by Blackwell's a few years ago was owned by the Harvard astrophysicist Jesse Greenstein. According to a biographical memoir after his death, the period after the Great Crash was, for Greenstein, one of indulgence in modern art, fashionably avant-garde literature, and adventures in the theatre. The Bridge copy, which Blackwell sold, went for a mere £450, 1% of the average price of a Walker Evans vintage print. American Photographs was produced in an edition of 5,000 copies, so a colophon at the end of the book tells us, but by 1962 it was long out of print. The 25th anniversary edition was produced by the museum, with anniversary editions at 50 and 75 years following. A purely commercial edition was issued by the East River Press in 1975 when the work fell out of US copyright. But I would like to know much more about this publication history. An interesting note at the back of the 75th anniversary edition, written in 2012, gives us an interesting detail on how the images were scanned from the 1938 reproductions in this latest edition to attempt as much fidelity with the original as possible, even though it was printed from digital files in Italy. There is much that the book historian still wants to know about American photographs to help us understand the interplay between his photographic ideas and how they were disseminated in print. My copy of the 1938 edition has the book label of Heifers in Cambridge, presumably inserted when it was a new book. I don't know enough of the use of these labels by bookshops like Heifers. So we know that the book was distributed outside of the US. The Chadwick Healy copy in the Bodleian has the inscription of King Vidor, the Hollywood producer, an interesting suggestion of East Coast aesthetics influencing those on the West Coast. I'd like to know more about the print runs, distribution networks, and ownership of the 1938 edition of American Photographs. I'd like to spend a little time now looking at what else is missing from books about photographs. Many of the great photo books of the 20th century, especially after the Second World War, were published as co-editions. Many of these great books from the decisive moment onwards have publishers collaborating with photographers in order to take advantage of economies of scale. They needed to raise the size of the print runs of the images, especially where the high quality reproduction was desired, with different letterpress to allow for translations into languages appropriate for the co-edition market. This would allow a photographer's work to reach a broader audience and to do so with the highest quality reproductions. Thomas Neurath kindly allowed me to look at files for several publications in the Thames and Hudson archives, and I'd love to spend a great deal more time with them as they're fascinating. We learn a lot about how some of the Cartier-Bresson monographs came into being, for example. These were co-editions with Robert Delpire, a famous publisher in Paris, for his books known in English as From One China to Another and The People of Moscow in 1955. The gravures were produced by Drager, more of whom later, and there was much toing and froing in letters and telegrams over the size of the print runs and the cost between Delpire, Drager and Thames and Hudson. The great advantage of having the widest markets open up is really clear to see. Thames and Hudson had a head start with offices in London and New York, so that one company could co-edition to two markets, with the French adding a third. We also see the attention to what would be in the book concern over how current the images would be. Had things changed in China? Here's one of these fantastic prints, and the Drager wrote reviews are just absolutely stunning. So Cartier-Bresson had originally taken his pictures in Moscow while photographing there for Life magazine. But the publisher was worried that these were too out of date. The Life images were taken and political events and social events had changed very much since then. But the archives also show us great concern from the publishers over the sales reps, crucial actors in getting books from the publisher into the hands of readers. In this case, the reason for a trace in the archives was how well or not they represented the people of Moscow. And there's a wonderful account of one of the publisher's staff just bumping into a window of a bookshop which was meant to have copies of The People of Moscow on display, but didn't. The same would be true in the 1980s for William Klein's Close-Up, co-edition by Thames & Hudson and Edition Braus in Heidelberg. And here you can see the two copies side by side. Klein's earlier city books get all the attention, in Power and Badger, for example, but Close-Up is a really powerful photo book with incredible full bleed spreads and really punchy printing. Let's find one of those here, for example. In the file in the Thames and Hudson archive, we see Klein's own meticulous concern over the quality of the printing, getting Braus to change printers twice, for example. Klein evidently made Thomas Neurath's life a nightmare, making changes right up to the last minute as the publishers rushed to get the book out to coincide with the season of Klein's films being shown in the US. The marketing of the books was critical for a commercial publisher, and that really comes across very, very strongly in the archival material. And here you can see, again, the concern that the publisher has over how many of these images are new and haven't been seen before. So Klein faxes a copy to them, and they're highlighted with the ones which have not appeared in print. The printers of photo books deserve much greater attention than they've gotten to date. They sometimes don't even get a mention in the book themselves, but they have a key role in taking an original photograph and turning it into a multiple that will be viewed, appreciated, and hopefully enjoyed by thousands of purchasers of the book and tens of thousands of readers afterwards. The work that printers do was championed, of course, by Richard Benson in his superb MoMA show and associated book, The Printed Picture, which I commend to you. Take the printers of some of the most famous and justly celebrated photo books of the 20th century. I'm talking about the printers of two great Cartier-Bresson books, The Decisive Moment, and of the first edition of Robert Frank's Americans, but also of this book, Brassai's Paris de Nuit. These were all printed by Drager Frères, a house that was founded in 1886 in Montrouge on the outskirts of Paris as a graphic house specializing in origination and printing of the highest quality in order to support the reproduction of works of art. They would soon expand to create a business model that combined advertising brochures and other material, including a lot of work for Renault, and latterly graphic design work, as well as purely images and printing. We see them, for example, in the 1930s, printing for the fine art marketplace various magazines that included serious avant-garde photography, like Minotaur and Verve. The speciality was gravure printing, and driven by the demands of high volume, high fidelity reproductions of images for their advertising business, they developed the expertise and reputation that got noticed by the growing art photography world. The book which cemented their reputation was Brassai's Paris de Nuit, published in 1938 as a magazine spin-off, in this case by Éditions Art et Métiers Graphiques. It laid down luscious, velvety rotogravure printed images in full bleed onto a sympathetic stock. And the openings have lost none of their power 84 years later. The following year, Brassai's photography was being shared in high-quality colour by another superb printer, Neogravure, this time for the magazine Verve. Issue 4, Volume 1, dated January to March 1939, for example, brought together text by Paul Valéry, Ambrose Vollard, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Federica Garcia Lorca, with contemporary art reproductions by Miro and Matisse, and monochrome rotogravure reproductions, including photography by Bill Brandt, as well as Brassai. In the late 1940s, Drager began to work with Henri Cartier-Bresson, largely through Thériade, the Greek expatriate editor of Verve, who had published Matisse's groundbreaking artist book, Jazz, and Cartier-Bresson's photographs alongside Brassai and Brandt. In the late 1940s, they conceived one of the greatest photo books of the 20th century, The Decisive Moment, also in French, Images à la Sauvette, which was published simultaneously in Paris and New York in 1952. And these are the Chadwick-Healy copies in the Bodleian. The rotogravure printing was done by Drager, although the origination was done elsewhere in Paris. And usually the book's colophon gives a prominent credit to the printers. The engraving and printing is the work of the master printers Dragère Frères of Paris. It completed the 22nd of July 1952. 10,000 copies were printed across 2 editions, showing the link between high volume and high quality that Dragère could sustain because of their experience with advertising and other highly commercial work. I've mentioned readers throughout the course of this lecture, and they have rightly become the focus of hugely important book historical study of earlier periods in recent years. Book historians looking at the Middle Ages and the early modern periods in the West are now spending a great deal of time looking at reception, provenance, annotation, presentation, and copy-specific aspects of the books that remain on library shelves for study. So it's right that we ask similar research questions. Who bought photo books? How were they encountered? What difference did reading them make? I'd like to mention just a couple. There is another book from the wonderful Chadwick Healy collection in the Bodleian. It's Man Ray's wonderfully inventive Facile, 1935, with text by Paul Eluard. The Chadwick Healy copy has a gift inscription to Charles Peignot, a massively influential figure in the Parisian book and publishing industries. He ran the type foundry Debonnet et Peignot and was involved in the important journals Art et Métier Graphique and Photographie that celebrated the work of avant-garde photographers and published a series of 25 photo books, including Brassai's Paris de Nuit. In my own collection, I have 2 books of Bill Brandt's photographs I'd like to share with you. One is his famous Bradford book, The English at Home, with his notorious juxtaposition of working class and upper class life. My very battered copy, bought for £1, has the stamps of the library of an RAF fighter squadron in World War II. I thought it interesting that a book by a German émigré photographer critically documenting English social life would be read by young airmen before going out to shoot at German airmen. I also picked up another somewhat battered book, this time a copy of the magazine There from 1940. In it are once again reproductions from medieval manuscripts as well as works of art by Matisse and so on, but also photographs by Brassai and Brandt. I was delighted to own a copy, but even more surprised to see the ownership inscription of Denis Healey in the year he took a double first from Oxford, and the year he resigned his membership of the Communist Party. I knew of Healey's passion for photography, but I'd like to know more about his collection of books. We're beginning to catalogue his archive at the Bodleian, and I hope it might give us some more hints. I'd like to end with a modest proposal. It's a suggestion for a conceptual model for thinking about the interplay between book history and the history of photography. It takes as its starting point Robert Darnton's famous diagram, The Communication Circuit, which he published in his important paper, What is the History of Books, in Daedalus in 1982. Bob's essay and his diagram have been revisited since then by several scholars, not least of which Bob himself, in an article in Modern Intellectual History in 2007. And this is Bob's original diagram. He suggested in that there were 3 key questions we should be asking. How do books come into being? How do they reach readers? And what do readers make of them? As a contribution, I'd like to offer an extension to the communication circuit that examines these questions from the perspective of the photographic book. Here's how I've adapted it. At the top of the chart, you can see the agency of photographers alongside writers and editors and their interplay with publishers. And I've added the Coedition publishers as being, from what I can see in the archives, very closely involved in the decision-making process alongside, if you like, the lead publisher. And I've also added in the photographers' agents and the syndication of photography through specialist parts of the, if you like, the photography industry. And they're absolutely critical, particularly in the reproduction of photographs through the magazines, which then end up being published in the books as well. I think we also need to understand more about the role of the photographic agents and syndication, as I was just saying. The role of origination of photographic plates and the repro work more generally needs to be brought into our thinking about the making of photomechanically illustrated books. And for early photography, for example, the place of mounters just to take one example, alongside binders, needs greater understanding. And Anthony Hamber has told us much about this neglected corner of the history of the book in his magnificent study on the reports from the juries for the Great Exhibition. How did photo books reach readers, and what did they make of them? Are really good questions, and generally unasked and unanswered in the history of photography, and they need more space in any new model. Please let me know if you have thoughts or suggestions as I continue to work on this diagram. In recent years, a number of important new studies have appeared that open up the world of the photographic book. I've mentioned Jeff Batchen's work already in this lecture and eagerly await his exhibition and book, A New Power, in the Bodleian next year. I've also mentioned Anthony Hamber's study of the books associated with the 1851 Great Exhibition, and I hope that his database will see the light of day soon as well. For more modern photographic books, Clément Cheroux's collaboration with Joseph Koudelka on The Making of Exiles, Koudelka's fabulous book, gives us the closest we can get to eavesdropping on the genesis of a photo book. From Robert Del Pia, who was the original publisher, from his recollection, we put small prints on a table, discovering subtleties in their associations, constructing without haste a sequence that we looked at afresh after a few days. The pleasure of putting it together. Two gazes, the one who saw, the other who sees what the one who saw. The very first dummy was made in 1983. Now, 30 years and many dummies later, we've made the third and final version of this book. It takes a while. Thank you for listening.